I think the left has shown us that they're not going to tolerate Christians and Christian civilization, and that they have a different civilization that they'd like to impose over and against Christian civilization. And if they're not just going to stop, we have to stop them.
Welcome back to the Kevin Roberts Show. Thanks for joining us. We are in store for an excellent conversation today. I would like to say that's true every week because we have the privilege of having every week great guests. This week, as sometimes is the case, we get not only a great guest and someone who I think is one of the leading thinkers and writers in the conservative movement today, but also a friend from my days in Austin, Texas, Daniel Davidson, senior editor at the Federalist, and just an all-around great American. Thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me, Kevin.
You got the great wisdom of living way outside Washington, D.C.
That's
and
right.
So it's a real treat that you're sitting here in the Imperial City, but thankfully in one of the outposts inside the Imperial City.
That's
the
right.
Federalist offices would be one of them. The Heritage Foundation would be another. There are at least a few others, but all of that to say, after day in, day out, over years, seeing you at St. Mary's Cathedral at Austin, other places, at Texas Public Policy Foundation around the Capitol. It's great to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you as well. I was texting a friend that I was here in D.C., and they referred to it as Mordor, which I thought was appropriate. I was like, Mordor indeed. Yeah. But here I am. Huh.
Yeah. Well, look, thanks for your work. And for anyone watching or listening to this who's not familiar with the work, I'll just right up front, even if I didn't know you personally, say that you are one of our go-to writers at Heritage. When we're trying to know more detail about something, a more sophisticated analysis, but most of all, John, I would have to say just good old-fashioned common sense that you bring to public policy, to cultural problems, as we'll talk about with your book. And unfortunately, that last part, common sense, that last attribute is not in high supply in Washington, D.C. So thanks for doing what you do.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your comments, and I appreciate you speaking highly of my work. I think, to your point about common sense being in short supply in D.C., it's, as we get into in the book, it's really a civilizational problem, right? Because there's a war kind of on reason that is afoot, and it has everything to do with the fact that we are moving into this post-Christian era as a civilization. And so reason there's a disfigurement of reason that the collapse of Christianity in public life is bringing to all these different debates that we have on all these different subjects. And so on the one hand, you have people invoking science and data and information to justify their policies or their arguments, and at the same time making war on reason and science and data, right? And so that's part of it is a vocabulary problem, right? Because people are talking out of both sides of their mouths right now. But it is indicative, I think, of a kind of collapse of reason, because reason belongs to the West. It belongs to Christendom. There's no, as Catholics, we know there's no real conflict between faith and reason. And as we discard Christian civilization, we're going to discard reason as well, and science and the things that we associate with the West.
Yeah, and just to riff off that for a minute, although we could spend an entire episode talking about it, it is just, I would say that it would be bad enough if reason were lacking so sorely as it is in the realm of politics. It's a much bigger problem that reason is lacking in practically everything. Although in the realm of politics and policy, where I spend my days, try not to think too much about it at night, but it's sort of something that's inescapable. I find that in conversations that I'm having with elected officials, and these are people, I mean, even as we sit here, I've got this long-running text thread with a member of Congress who's a friend and a good person. But I realize that member of Congress and I are disputing over vocabulary. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to go as far as to say this person is irrational. I'm not making that claim. But it's the point that even people who share a worldview, like to someone on the political left, they would say, this member of Congress and I have an identical worldview. Well, I've discovered today we don't. We use different vocabularies to describe the same exact set of facts. This is a symptom downstream of, I think, our institutions, the institutions of Christendom itself, that have failed, at least partially, to protect reason. You and I can have a good time getting really intellectual and academic about this, and that would be fine with me. But I think the real takeaway here is in the daily lives of Americans, this affects us in so many ways. Personal relationships, politics, as we'll talk about, but also, as you mentioned in your book, and we'll properly introduce it here in a minute, just cultural institutions, our churches, our professional associations, almost everything. In a nutshell, how did we get here in 2024, where reason is in such short supply?
Well, before we talk about how we got here, I'll just say, to your point about how it affects ordinary Americans, it falls most heavily on the most vulnerable Americans, right? R.R. Reno and others have written about this, about how the progressive or leftist worldview is kind of a luxury good that the upper class can afford, but it ruins the communities and the lives of people who are poor, who are working class, who are maybe struggling, who need those institutions, right? Those institutions of Christian civilization that in an earlier era lifted them up or supported them, when they couldn't support themselves, or sort of acted as a bulwark for whole communities, maybe that were in the bottom, at the bottom of the heap. Now, as those institutions decay, those people are left kind of exposed, right? And without the assistance and aid that they once had. And people at the top of the heap can sort of get along without that. They can afford these this war on reason. They can afford the indulgences of identity politics, or of exploring, identities, or destroying and reforming family structures, right? That's, if you do that society-wide, you're going to destroy a lot of people's lives. And we are seeing that right now, especially with the family.
I imagine as you were grappling with that reality and others, the idea for this book came to the fore. So the question is, what prompted the book?
Yeah.
In particular, I know for a lot of authors, there's a light bulb moment.
Yes. In fact, it was writing about this stuff at the Federalist and starting to write columns that were kind of circling the subject, trying to define it and describe what's happening. And the catalyst was totally a happenstance. And I mention it in the acknowledgments section of the book, where I also thank you for your help. It was going to see this movie that came out a couple years ago called The Northman, which is about a pre-Christian era Viking revenge epic. It's an interesting movie, but I don't know. Have you seen it?
I haven't.
Okay.
But it sounds great.
Well, it's not
so far.
It's not fun to watch, right? And the reason it's well made, and it was my brother-in-law in Austin went to Alamo for his birthday to watch it, and afterwards we met up with our wives and our mother and father-in-law for a birthday dinner, and we started describing this film to the horror of our wives, and they're like, "Stop talking about this because it's horrible," because it depicts the brutality of pre-Christian Norse paganism, right? And I realized, and I ended up writing something about it for the Federalist. I hadn't planned to write about it. I was just going to the movie, but the director made an unintentional case for Christian civilization in his realistic and harrowing depiction of paganism. And this is paganism right on the eve of the arrival of Catholicism to Scandinavia. And it occurred to me that if it hadn't been for those sort of stalwart monks that pushed into Northern Europe, in the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries and grappled with paganism and converted those peoples, much of Europe and the world may still be languishing in paganism today. And it started me thinking about what is paganism and what are we moving into as we move into a post-Christian era, and how might paganism be returning? And I didn't have the idea for the book. I got an email from Harry Crocker, who was my editor at Regnery, and he said, "I enjoy your writing. Would you like to write a book?" And I said, "Yes." And I gave him a whole pitch that I'd prepared to write a book about the border, which I'd reported on for many years. And he said, "Nobody reads border books. What about this column you wrote about the Northmen and about the return of paganism in the post-Christian West?" And I thought, I never thought anyone would ask me to write a book about that, but I would love to. And that's how. And so I started formulating an idea for expounding that sort of exploration that began with this film. The other column that Harry pointed to was a column I'd written that summer about the month of June and how Christians need to reclaim the month of June for Corpus Christi, which it traditionally has been the month dedicated to the Sacred Heart of Jesus and the Feast of Corpus Christi at the center of those celebrations, and reclaim it from the LGBTQ movement. It's not Pride Month; it's the month of the Sacred Heart, and to assert Christian civilization and Christian tradition over and against this new paganism that we see rising up everywhere, especially in the LGBTQ movement.
What a moving explanation. I didn't know the connection between this barbaric movie, The Northman, which I now will watch and give you a call after I've seen it, and the inspiration for the book. So the book, in case someone's listening and not watching, because we have a copy here on set, is Pagan America, The Decline of Christianity in the Dark Ages to Come. Not exactly a hopeful title, my friend.
No, I thought they were going to change it, but they didn't.
they share what seems to be a certain pessimism about the future.
Yeah, I also didn't design the cover, but it's a burning church. No, when I saw it, I was like, okay, I guess if you're going to make an argument like this, you kind of have to go all in, right? And the argument is in as briefly as I can put it, America was founded as a Christian nation, or at least it was founded with a Christian people, and the people who founded our country understood that it was only going to work, Republican self-government was only going to work with a Christian people, right? And we are no longer a Christian people, and so our form of government, our American civilization, is going to change radically. And what America was in the past, it will no longer be as we move into this post-Christian era that is now emerging. And why I call it a pagan era or Pagan America is another assertion in the book, which is that the only real alternative to Christianity or Christendom is some form of paganism. And the paganism of the 21st century is not going to look like the paganism of ancient times, of pre-Christian times. But it will be no less pagan for all that, because the pagan ethos does not change over time. It remains the same, and it remains an inversion of the Christian ethos or the Christian worldview, and that's really what the book is about.
So, do you find that Americans of faith, whatever the faith may be, but particularly Christian faiths, have been slow to recognize this?
Oh yes,
happening?
Yes.
And is that the part of the, if not the root of the problem, part of the problem?
Yes. One of my goals for the book is just to get Christians to wrap their heads around this and accept it, right? The book doesn't have a chapter at the end like a lot of books have of like these 10 steps to save America. There is no, it's not, the book is not a counsel of despair, but I'm also not going to gaslight people into thinking that like an election cycle is going to turn this around, or a majority in Congress or a Supreme Court decision is going to turn this around. It took generations, centuries really, to get here, and it's going to take generations to get out. So it is a call to arms and a call really to change the way that you live if you need to, and prepare the ground for your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren so that they can refound the republic when the time is right and when they're able to. But that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about winning an election. We're talking about refounding a republic.
Two things strike me about that response. The first is what I appreciate about your writing, and I have since we first met during my return to Austin about 10 years ago, and that is, while you have a supernatural joy, which every person of faith has, you're also willing to be a realist, even when elected officials and the people who celebrate their activity would suggest you should not. And this is a compliment. I really mean it this way. And we need more people with your ability to analyze cultural and political and social and economic systems to have that mindset. And it doesn't mean that we can't also tie that to a supernatural joy. For that matter, even a natural joy, in the strict sense of the term, a secular joy, a joy about this life. It's just that it's got to be long term, and that's my second point. That at Heritage, just as an example, there are other entities, no doubt, who adopt this. I think part of the reason that we can remain cheerful, which we really are, in spite of legislative losses here and there. That's the nature of our business, is that we're playing the long game.
Yeah.
And the long game is about institutions. The long game is about revitalizing truth. But that starts with fellow people of faith waking up.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not saying that we should not engage in politics or that we should not be cheerful warriors, right?
This is not a Benedict option book.
No.
Although that gets a little misunderstood too.
So I engage with the Benedict option, and Rod blurbed the book very kindly for
Rod's
me
a
as
great
well.
friend, yeah.
I loved the Benedict option, but I think events have moved. Benedict option came out in 2017, right? Seems like a long time ago, 2017. Things have moved, I think, more quickly than Rod even predicted they would. His work has always been prescient, and the Benedict option was prescient. And what my last chapter I titled the Boniface option as a way to engage with his thesis. And the argument is that it's necessary. The Benedict option is necessary but not sufficient, right? And so far from saying that politics won't save us, so let's retreat from politics, I argue that we have to find and fight on ground we can win, right? So, but the key is to fight, right? We cannot hope to just build an ark and ride out the storm and then pick through the rubble when it's over. And we're gonna need the ark too, but we also need sort of like an ark that's also a destroyer. We need the ark and the sword together. And what does that mean? In practice, it means going out into your nearest communities first and proclaiming the Christian faith, not just in a proselytizing sense, but taking the faith back into the public square. Because one of the things that has happened over the past century is we've adopted this notion that our Christian faith is private and the secular space or the public space is secular. And there has to be this wall of separation between the two, which is, we talk about in the book, this total misunderstanding of Jefferson for one. But that means taking back your, finding and fighting on ground you can win means maybe you have to move out of a place like Austin, Texas, right? And move to a smaller community where you can take over the city council or the school board or the library. And you can keep things out that you want to keep out, and you can bring things back in that should be part of the public space. And you do that in your community where you have thick community and you have support and you have your church and your family and your wider network, and then you use that as a beachhead, and from there you push forward, and maybe you push forward into the state legislature or county politics, or you move to a state where there is ground that you can hold, like in Texas or Florida, and we see these efforts there of almost like two different countries developing, between these blue states and these red states. That contrast is going to grow. And I think people who want to preserve Christian civilization and who want to give their children and grandchildren an opportunity to refound the Republic have to start thinking about ways that they can bring the Christian faith and Christian civilization back into the public square as not just a part of the public square, but really the basis of the public square. The whole idea of a public square is a Christian idea anyway, right? So that's
the Gospel Commission has a certain public-facing component to it, right?
Yeah, exactly. So so anyway, that's all that to say. It's not a counsel of despair, despite the burning church on the cover. It's just trying to wake people up, because if you don't believe that there's a problem, if you believe that winsomeness is enough, right? If you believe that it's just enough to be tolerated and that the left will tolerate you, I think that's delusional. I think the left has shown us that they're not going to tolerate Christians and Christian civilization, and that they have a different civilization that they'd like to impose over and against Christian civilization. And if they're not just going to stop, we have to stop them.
I'm just going to say, sort of momentarily break the exchange that you and I have and address our audience and say that you need to press pause. If you're in the audience, press pause and go back 3 or 4 minutes when John just began this description, because that answer is the perfect answer to the question, what's the single most important thing we can do to save America? What you described, which is making sure we are witnessing to our faith in the public square, not necessarily only proselytizing, although it can be that. It could also just be mentioning that we're people of faith in the public square. It could be doing what we do at Heritage. And we're not being disrespectful to people of other faiths. We begin meals here in prayer. Even with ambassadors of other countries who are, for example, Muslim, they rather appreciate that they find Americans doing this. But the second thing, very much connected to being a witness to our faith, that I think people should home in on is realizing that there are some cities, there are some states that at least in the near term aren't worth our time.
Right.
They're not worth our tax money. And it is not giving up on the project of taking back America by giving up on those particular places. And I think about a place we probably both consider our adopted hometown of Austin, Texas. And I just saw yesterday, as an example, that 22% of students in the Austin Independent School District left this year. Now, this is a place of huge economic prosperity. This is not because of a lack of economic opportunity for their parents, wherever they may be on the socioeconomic scale, from very wealthy people in Austin to people who are on the opposite end. This is a result of parents of all socioeconomic strata voting with their feet and saying, I'm done with this place. Yeah. And all of that to say, I think of examples like what Matt Peterson has done in the Dallas-Fort Worth area with local elections, his compatriot Nate Fisher, who's also a friend of Heritage, with what they're doing with some of these communities. I think about how there are these great institutions of higher learning that not only themselves are great witnesses to the faith, Christendom College, Wyoming Catholic College, dear to me because I led it for a few years, that those institutions are important witnesses, but also what's happened in the communities where they reside is that the people affiliated with the institutions directly and indirectly become the leaven in the secular parts of their societies. But you went to the crown jewel of these examples, and that's Hillsdale College.
Well, I also recently went to Stubenville, Ohio, and I'd never been there before. I went there to record some podcasts for the book, and I knew that there was the Franciscan University there of Stubenville, but what I didn't know and found out just there a few days is that the place is becoming a colony of Catholic civilization in the former Rust Belt. Over the past 3 years or so, something like 100 Catholic families have moved to Stubenville. They're not connected to the university. People are just moving there now as they're moving there because it's become a beachhead for Christian civilization. And they want to be part of it. And they want to be in a community that recognizes our Christian faith. They want to be part of a public square that is ordered around the Christian faith and the truth that Christianity proclaims. And it's an incredibly powerful and attractive model for revitalizing old Rust Belt towns, right? I have a friend who I recorded a podcast there, a professor at the university, Andrew Willard Jones, who's a great intellect and a medieval scholar who I consulted on this book with. And him and a group of professors at Franciscan University are starting something called St. Joseph's College. And they have their first crop of students coming in this fall. And it is a 6-year program where at the end of the 3 years on campus and 3 years of apprenticeship. And at the end of 6 years, you have a bachelor's in Catholic studies and you are a journeyman apprentice, electrician, plumber, HVAC, or carpentry, which of the 4 disciplines you want to choose. And all these students are going to be housed downtown Stubenville. It's going to completely transform the downtown of that city and revitalize it in the best possible way by giving young men and women a classical Catholic education and giving them the means to support a family when they get out of it without hardly any student debt. So this is what I mean when I say find and fight on ground you can win. They have formed a beachhead in Stubenville. They're gaining ground, and what they're doing there has a potential to transform. You know, if you could export that model for that college to other places and there should be a St. Joseph's, College of St. Joseph the Worker in every Rust Belt town across the fruited plain, right? That's what I mean, right? Or Hillsdale is another example of a place that I graduated from Hillsdale about 20 years ago. I know I don't look it, but it has too become this beachhead for Christian civilization, right? Even though it's an unaffiliated college, that is projecting now out from the college in planting schools, and helping other people start homeschooling co-ops and charter schools, and because it's not enough to just have one institution in one city in Michigan. You have to colonize the whole country, and that's why I'm optimistic. Not that this is going to be accomplished in our lifetimes, but these institutions, if they continue to do what they're doing, are going to be the source of a rebirth of Christian civilization in the West.
It reminds me so much of the foundation of the institution that I led, Wyoming Catholic College, and not just because of that college in and of itself, which is certainly meritorious. It's the context in which it was founded, or probably more accurately put, the foundation of it, and that is John Senior's Integrated Humanities Program at the University of Kansas. And that program, which existed, as you know, for just a few academic years, was ended because of its success in forming students, not just teaching them, but forming them. And what has happened since it was shuttered in the 1970s, even though it was short-lived, is that many of the leaders of these kinds of entities, Wyoming Catholic College, many Catholic bishops of dioceses, some Protestant leaders as well, they basically had this mindset amid the just demise, as they saw it, as certainly Dr. Senior saw it, of Christian culture, deciding that they were going to revitalize it. And what made me think about that, John, is having read your book, thinking about the subtitle about the Dark Ages, but your response just now. And if you permit me just one more minute, just to kind of geek out as a John Seniorite, your book also reminds me of his The Death of Christian Culture. And people misread Senior's intention there in the same way they misread our mutual friend Rod Dreher's intention with the Benedict option, and someone might misread your intention, especially by judging a book by its cover, right? Which
Right.
is to say, you're saying, the country's gone to hell in a handbasket. There's no emerging from this. And what I love about what you're saying is, yes, continue to do politics, continue to do policy, but use my words, there's more to life than that too. And we've got to have more of a long-term vision about really leaning into places you would least expect it. If you show up, someone's never been to Stubenville, Ohio, and I intend this not as a slight. I mean, I grew up on the Gulf Coast, like one of the ugliest parts of America.
Right.
Some of the greatest people, but ugly in terms of nature. Steubenville is nothing to write home about.
Right.
It's one of the last places you would expect there to be a revitalization of any kind of culture.
Totally.
But it's happening. And so I go in this long screed, John, to encourage what you're doing, but also people in the audience. This is vital.
I have an anecdote about Steubenville I have to share. To your point, it is like a quintessential Rust Belt town on a bend in the Ohio River, which is in a beautiful part of the country. Southeastern Ohio is a spectacular country. I married a Midwesterner, so I have a soft spot in my heart for the Midwest. I was staying at a hotel across the street from the Franciscan University, and the morning that I was supposed to leave, I was supposed to get a ride to the Pittsburgh airport, which is like a half an hour away. But I wanted to go to Mass that morning downtown at St. Peter's in Stubenville. And so I didn't have a car, and I texted the person who was driving me. I said, can you just pick me up at St. Peter's, and we'll go from there. I'm just going to go to 8 a.m. Mass. And he said, I'll be there too. I'll just meet you there. And I said, great. So I was just going to walk, because I looked it up. It was a 20-minute walk, beautiful morning. I walked out, the hotel is not really in a walkable place.
I know the hotel.
So you know what I'm talking about. So I kind of knew the direction I needed to go. So I walked across the parking lot, and then I came to the end of the parking lot. It was kind of like broken concrete and like a scrub field. And then there was like some crumbling houses. And it was kind of a dystopic scene. And at the end of the scrub field was two concrete vehicle barriers and like a path, like a scraggly path in between them that led out to a dead end street, and then beyond, and that's where the neighborhood started for the downtown area, and then you could kind of walk from there. And these two concrete barriers, there was graffiti on them, but you know what the graffiti was? In yellow spray paint was a Cairo cross and an arrow pointing the direction of St. Peter's. So that people, and I realized why it was there. It's like this, and it was like, I had to do a double take. I realized it's because people who are staying at this hotel often are walking from the hotel downtown to go to Mass. And so someone spray painted a Cairo cross and an arrow so they would know this is the way to go. Like that, to me, I was like, something is going on here. something special. And to your point earlier, there's an opening here. There's an opening amid the collapse of Western civilization. We see openings everywhere for the restoration, right? To your point about Austin and the collapse of public schools there, Austin's one of the fastest growing cities in the country. It has been for many years. How could one of the fastest growing cities in the country have 22% of their public school enrollment be just walking away, right? They're just walking away from the public school system. This is happening in communities all over the country. People are literally just walking away. In my home community in Alaska, where I grew up, there's been a movement for many years, a strong homeschool movement in Alaska because of very permissive, like liberal in the good sense, homeschool laws. You basically just tell the state you're homeschooling your kid, and that's the end of the story. COVID accelerated that once people started realizing what their kids were learning, or better yet, not learning in schools. The public schools in South Central Alaska are on the verge of collapse because so many people have pulled their kids out of school and are either doing charter schools or private school or homeschools or homeschool co-ops. The school districts are desperate to retain students, and they're almost willing to do anything. But you can begin to see, like, the giant is teetering. The public school teachers union backed giant is teetering in these communities. It's on the verge of collapse. And if people keep at it, if they keep up, the giant will come down, and there'll be an opportunity, an opening there to create something new in its place. And that if that's happening from Austin to Alaska, all over the country.
There's a dual lesson there, at the very least, both about Austin and the great story you say about Alaska. And it is, on the one hand, that I find conservatives, I'm as guilty of this as anyone, don't realize when we have the advantage, and so we fail to press the advantage that we have. Mm-hmm. It goes back to your point about fighting, what I like to say, being on offense. But the second thing is, and I think we're even worse at this as it relates to public policy and politics, we're much better at it in terms of our private lives. Mm-hmm. We are institution builders. That's one of the attributes of conservatives, at least Anglo-American conservatives. But we tend to do that, like, segmented in our professional spheres, our spheres at home with our families and our neighborhoods. We don't, in other words, fuse those two things. And it's vital that we do that we not only press the advantage that we clearly have in education and other arenas, but that we recognize it will not be enough, as I remind my school choice friends, just to get universal school choice.
Right.
In other words, if I had a magic wand, I would use it to create universal school choice. That's not even half the solution. Yep. The other part, which you're really driving the point home about, is we have to go take advantage of the opportunity that's there. And in the case of school reform and school choice, we have to go build those institutions. They don't have to be huge schools for 1,000 students. They can be micro schools, but we have to get about the business of doing that now.
And make sure they're teaching the right thing. Like, it's not enough, like the neutrals public square, we have to get over this idea that is the end state ideal, right? The neutral public square itself, and I talk about this in the book, is a luxury that only a Christian civilization, only a Christian society can afford, right? Tolerance itself, religious tolerance, is something that you only find in a Christian society, right? So we don't want universal school choice, to bring it back to your point, just because we like choice. We want to be free to choose the good. That's what freedom is, right? And I quote John Paul II on that. You know, freedom is not the freedom to do as you like, but the freedom to do what you ought. And so there is a normative claim behind the push for something like school choice. We want school choice. We want vouchers for parents so they can take their kids to a particular kind of school that will teach them Western civilization, that will teach them about, Christian moral precepts, that will instill in them Christian moral virtues, because those are the kind of people that we need for a republic. And if we don't have those people, we will not have a republic. We'll have a pagan empire, right? And so we are now about the business of doing war against a pagan empire. And so that is what people have to wrap their heads around and go forth and fight.
Yeah, it strikes me that if someone needs encouragement beyond your exhortation just now, and I'm not sure why they would, they could just look around them and look at these so-called anti-Israel protests. They're certainly anti-Semitic in most cases. That is the rotten fruit of this problem. But it leads me to this question, John. I know you're not going to give us 10 steps of what we can do to save America, but I'm going to ask for one. And that's on behalf of people in the audience who are parents or grandparents. And this is one of the most common questions I get when I'm out traveling on Heritage's behalf. Kevin, what kind of college should I send or encourage my child or grandchild to go to? You might list specific ones. We've listed a few, but is there sort of a rubric that you would encourage people to develop as families for their kids?
I would say that we need to let go of the idea that all kids need to go to college in the first place. Right?
That's a good reminder.
College is good, right? I went to Hillsdale. I was lucky that I found it, right? One of my nephews is at Hillsdale right now. I have a niece at Ave Maria in Florida, but not everybody needs to go to college. And I think, especially because not everybody can go to Hillsdale or Wyoming Catholic or Ave Maria. These are small places, right? If you can't go to a place like that, it would be better to go nowhere than to go to a state school or to go to an Ivy League. Like, I would never want any child or relative or friend of mine to go to an Ivy League institution. So we talked earlier just a second ago about walking away from the public schools. We need to walk away from the colleges and universities that are beyond repair, that those are institutions that should be abandoned, especially with these protests, right? We shouldn't even stop the protests. Like, let those college administrators like hang it around their necks like a millstone. They created this. They own it. It's theirs. These are their students. This is their ideology and practice. And it's going to destroy those institutions. Let them burn. And what do you do instead? Well, build communities where you can raise a family and support a family without having to have a 4-year degree from a corrupt institution, and start to get creative about that and build into your vision for your family and for your children and for your grandchildren a different kind of future. Because what has been in the past, like the world that kind of we grew up in, is gone, and it's not coming back. So we need to start thinking about what kind of a world are we going to build for the generations that will refound the republic. And maybe that means going to a place like Hillsdale or Wyoming Catholic, but maybe it means going to a place like the College of St. Joseph the Worker, or maybe it just means being an apprentice for an electrician or something else. But we need to start getting creative.
Last question for now. I sort of semi-promised before we started recording that we'll go do this on location in Alaska sometime. Hopefully you'll write many more books and be back on the show. The typical question I ask, I'm not going to ask you, not because you don't have supernatural joy, but frankly because I'm more interested in your case in this other one. But the typical question I ask is, why'd you wake up hopeful today about the American future? It's a spin on that. And it is, how much time do you think we have as a civil society in the United States, if you had to guess? That is to say, the reason behind that question, John, is how urgent must we be in the actions we take?
Time's up. Time is up. I argue this in the book. The things that we have associated with our American way of life, right? The Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, free exercise of religion, consent of the governed, the ability to choose our leaders through free and fair elections. All that is going to go away. I think that will go away in our lifetimes. I think it's I don't think there's any stopping that. And I think that we can see the broad contours of that coming into being right now. The state will persecute Americans who do not adhere to regime doctrine on a whole host of things, but especially on these questions of identity, of gender and race identity, and if you don't buy into that and you don't affirm that, then the heavy hand of the state's going to come down on you. It's already starting to come down. So I think we should expect it, and we can there's a certain kind of repose that we can have in knowing that is going to happen. America is going to become evil. right? The state is going to become evil. It will not be responsive to the citizens anymore. Democracy, right? The left talks about preserving democracy. They don't really mean preserving a government that's accountable to the people who express their preferences in voting. What they mean is preserving the institutions of the West, right? A lot of these state institutions. We need to understand that those institutions are our enemies now, and sort of gird ourselves for that. And so, since we're out of time, there's not a moment to lose. We need to get on with the business of building the alternative institutions, building an alternative civil society, and making it as strong and as robust and as redundant as possible, and do that with all haste and also with joy and with a conviction in the justness of our cause, because it's okay. It's okay if the state persecutes us. It's okay if the regime is evil, because we have a supernatural hope and we have assurances that all will be well and all manner of things will be well.
John Davidson, I knew this would be exhilarating intellectually. It certainly was for me, I'm sure for the audience, and hopefully worth your time. Thanks for writing your book, Pagan America. I was one of the early readers of it. Happy to be promoting it for you. I encourage everyone in the audience to buy a copy. Most of all, thank you for your own witness in reminding us what's at stake and what each of us, even if we think we have nothing to do or have nothing to offer, right, that we actually do. God bless you.
Thanks, Kevin.
I hope you enjoy that conversation as much as I did. John Davidson really is a national treasure. He's a humble guy, so he wouldn't say that, but I can say that about him. Go buy his book, Pagan America, and two things can be true at once. You can believe that things really are challenging in the United States today, but also, if we take some advice from John, that over the long term, we will get it back on track. Take care in the meantime. We will prevail.
The Kevin Roberts Show is brought to you by more than 500,000 members of the Heritage Foundation. The executive producer is Crystal Kate Bonham. Sound design by Lauren Evans, Mark Guiney, and Tim Kennedy. For more information and to subscribe, please visit heritage.org.